By the 1950s, both the USA and the Soviet Union had developed hydrogen bombs, and if these went off, it would cause something called mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short, so MAD. And so this meant that the USA and the Soviet Union had to find different ways to resolve any problems, because if they resorted to weapons, then it would end the world pretty much. So this is why the Cold War never went hot. The Warsaw Pact was established on the 14th of May 1955, and this was in response to NATO, and it was basically a collective defence treaty for all Soviet countries. And not only did this symbolise the strong Iron Curtain that was being metaphorically drawn up in Europe, dividing the communists from the capitalists, and it also allowed the Soviet Union to have a tighter grip on its satellite states. During the 1950s in Berlin, there was a huge refugee problem because most people in East Germany wanted to move to West Germany because it was a lot more prosperous, the economy was better. So this meant that 2.7 million East Germans crossed the border. And this looked really bad on the Soviets because it showed that people preferred capitalism to communism. And so in response, Khrushchev released his Berlin Ultimatum in 1958, and they stated that Berlin belonged to East Germany and he wanted West troops to leave in 6 months because he wanted Berlin to be a free city. So to try and resolve these increasing tensions, 4 summit meetings took place between 1959 and 1961. I'm on the wrong page. So the first one was Geneva in May 1959, and both sides, being USA and Soviet Union, put forward proposals but no decision was made. And then Camp David was in September 1959 also, which was between Eisenhower from the USA and then Khrushchev again. And no agreement was made, but Khrushchev withdrew his Berlin Ultimatum, which was a promising sign. But then Paris in May 1960 was an absolute disaster because previously there was some U-2 spy planes which belonged to America that flew over the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union shut it down. And so at this meeting, Eisenhower refused to apologise for that to Khrushchev, so he walked out. And then the last one was Vienna in June 1961. And by this point, Khrushchev had renewed the Berlin Ultimatum and now was president of the USA. And because he was quite young and seemed inexperienced, Khrushchev tried to kind of mess him around, and he didn't like that. So he increased spending on the forces in the USA to $2 billion. In response to the failed summit meetings and the refugee problem, Khrushchev decided to build the Berlin Wall. And by October 1961, West Berlin was completely cut off from East Berlin. And the point of this was that people from East Berlin couldn't try and get across because they'd be shot. And the wall became a symbol of division between the entire world, as it showed the complete divide between communists and capitalists. And in response, in 1963, Kennedy visited West Berlin and made a famous speech where 200,000 people listened, and he famously said, "Ich bin eine Berliner," which means I am a citizen of Berlin, kind of metaphorically saying we're all in this together, and also means I am a donut, so fun fact for you there. And this also demonstrated that the USA were willing to defend West Berlin against communists. And although the wall was bad, it also was quite good in a sense that a wall was seen as better than war, since it stopped military alerts in Berlin. And also it was kind of a defeat for the communists. It was quite humiliating because it showed that the citizens of East Berlin had to be forced to stay in a communist regime. Generally, Khrushchev believed that both the USA and the Soviet Union could live peacefully together. He encouraged something called DeStalinization, which basically meant he wanted the Soviet Union not to be seen as a dictatorship. And now moving into Hungary, Hungary suffered quite a lot during Stalin's reign. Their leader was quite brutal. He was known as Stalin's best pupil, which generally is a bad thing. So in October 1956, Hungarians started to kind of rise up against communist rule. So Khrushchev, in response, appointed Nagy instead, who was more liberal, and he calmed the situation in Hungary, and the Hungarians liked him as a leader. But Nagy started to ask for a lot of reforms. For example, he wanted free elections. But the big problem was when he announced he wanted Hungary to leave the Warsaw Pact. Khrushchev did not want Hungary to leave the Warsaw Pact, as he saw this as a threat to communism as a whole, because if Hungary left the Warsaw Pact, then other countries in the Warsaw Pact might see this and want to follow. So he ordered a Soviet invasion of Hungary and sent 200,000 troops, and over 5,000 Hungarians were killed, and Nagy was also executed as an example. And the key thing was the USA's policy of containment meant military action could only prevent the spread of communism, and so they wouldn't want to interfere with satellite states in case it started nuclear war, basically. And so this meant the Soviets' position was secure within the Warsaw Pact, since its members knew they wouldn't get any military support from America if they tried to leave, so hence wouldn't try to leave. In 1959, Cuba had a socialist revolution headed by Fidel Castro. Cuba started to build economic links with the Soviet Union. For example, Russia bought Cuban sugar and Cuba bought Russian oil. And America really didn't like this. They saw it as a threat because they didn't want any socialism in their sphere of influence. And so in response, the CIA told Kennedy that a US-backed invasion to overthrow Castro would work, and they could train Cuban exiles, which are people who had to leave Cuba after the revolution. And this led to the Bay of Pigs on the 17th of April 1961, which was pretty much a disaster for the USA because they didn't want to seem like they were involved, but their US planes were instantly recognised and photographed. And Castro knew of this invasion in advance, and he had 20,000 troops ready compared to the 1,400 US-backed troops. And the CIA were hoping that everyday Cuban people would get involved. However, they liked Castro because before him they had a dictator called Batista, and so they all backed Fidel. NATO had missiles in Turkey, which is a short distance from the Soviet Union, and so Khrushchev wanted to put missiles in Cuba because it meant they had leverage and they could put the USA under threat. And then on the 14th of October 1962, US U-2 spy planes saw the Cuban missile sites. And so in response, Kennedy called an executive committee, which was called ExCon for short, and they met for 13 days just to discuss how they wanted to respond to this threat. And so on the 22nd, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba. And the Soviet Union saw this as an aggressive attack, and they decided that their ships were going to ignore this and continue sailing to Cuba anyway. And so at this point, the USA and the Soviet Union started to prepare for nuclear war, which was very scary for everybody at this time because a war between them two, the two powers, would lead to the end of the world pretty much. And so luckily on the 24th, the Soviet Union ships turned around and went away. And so after this, Khrushchev offered to remove missiles from Cuba if the USA agreed not to invade Cuba. But then the next day, Khrushchev added that he also wanted the USA's missiles to be removed from Turkey. And then Kennedy agreed not to invade publicly, but then secretly his brother Robert Kennedy agreed to a secret deal to remove these Turkish missiles. And so for the short-term consequences, Kennedy was seen as very good because he stood up to Khrushchev, and so his popularity increased. But in Moscow, it was seen as a humiliating defeat for the Soviets, and so Khrushchev was dismissed in 1964. And so the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis meant the US and the Soviet Union agreed to stop following a policy of brinkmanship and started to work towards détente, which I'll talk about in the next video. And in June 1963, a hotline was set up, which was a direct communication line between Moscow and Washington to stop any miscommunications. And in August 1963, the Test Ban Treaty was signed, which agreed to stop testing nuclear weapons everywhere except underground. And in 1967, the Outer Space Treaty was signed, which agreed not to use space for military purposes. And then in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation was signed, and this was signed by countries that had knowledge and technology of nuclear weapons, and they agreed not to share this knowledge with any other countries.